Hello, everyone. This is Deborah Jennings, Director of the Center for Parent Information and Resources, and welcome to our last workshop session for this conference. I want to first thank all of you for participating in our National Parent Center Conference that has gone virtual, and then to welcome you to this session titled Building Collaborative State Capacity, Parent Training and Information Centers, partnering with their state education agencies and statewide family engagement centers. Today we have three presenters who are going to be talking to us about working with statewide family engagement centers, working with your state education agencies, and really how to really partner for systems change at the state level. Joining us is Reyna Hernandez, who is the Director of Research and Policy Development at the National Association for Family, School, and Community Engagement, also known as NAFSKY. Also, Sherri Wilson. Many of you who have been in the Parent Center Network for a long time may remember Sherri Wilson. She is currently the Director of Engagement and State Partnerships at NAFSKY. And finally, last but not least, is Cambria Russell, who is the director for the Massachusetts Statewide Family Engagement Center, which is housed at the Federation for Children with Special Needs in Massachusetts, which is, little point of history here, the very first Parent Training and Information Center in America. So we have a really great group of presenters who have a lot of history with parent centers and a lot of expertise in family engagement for systems change. I'm going to hand it over to our presenters.
Thank you so much, Deborah. Super excited to be here. It's been so long since I've been to any kind of PTI event or activity, so it's really exciting for me to be back. So we are going to dive right in. Today, we are going to focus on learning about some of the things that are happening at state level education agencies and statewide family engagement centers. We have one of the best and the brightest with us here to share with you some of the things they're doing. We'll talk a little bit about some of the things they're doing in other states. You're also going to learn about ways that the PTIs have partnered with the states for a variety of different efforts. And ways that you might want to replicate that. And we'll talk about ways that you can engage in the efforts taking place in your own state. A lot of states have statewide family engagement centers. Not all of them do, but many. And so we'll talk about some of the ways you might partner with them if you're in one of those states. We always like to start by letting everybody know about NAFSKY and our mission and vision. Because we are the only national association for family, school, and community engagement. And our mission is to advance high impact policies and practices that promote child development and student achievement. We want to see a world where family engagement is universally practiced as a strategy to improve children's learning. So we are gonna dive right into our content now. Cambria, tell us a little bit about the Federation and the Massachusetts Statewide Family Engagement Center.
So like Sherri and Deborah both said, I work at the Federation for Children with Special Needs, and we're located in Massachusetts. And at FCSN, we provide information, support, and assistance to parents of children with disabilities, their professional partners, and their communities. And one of the many projects at FCSN is the Massachusetts Statewide Family Engagement Center, and this is the project that I direct. The Federation is the lead agency on this project, and we have amazing partners in our work, including NAFSKY. And the SFEC aims to strengthen the capacity of educators and families and other supporters of children to collaborate for the well-being and achievement of children in Massachusetts.
So my name is Reyna Hernandez, as they mentioned, and the first thing that we wanted to share with you is a little bit of the work that's been happening in states across the country to establish statewide family engagement frameworks. We, in particular, are focusing on some work that we've been engaged in, but there are states beyond, those that we've worked with that have done this work. So if we go on to the next slide, we've got one of the projects that we were very privileged to work on was working with the Council for Chief State School Officers, along with the Mid-Atlantic Equity Consortium, the Maryland Department of Education, the Campaign for Grade Level Reading, and the Policy Equity Group, with 2 cohorts of 18 states. So you see the states listed here, but there are states beyond those listed here that have also gone on to establish frameworks, including places like California and Wisconsin. And this project really was trying to do a number of different things. The main goal, the main objective, was to develop a framework that cut across birth or prenatal through grade 12 or beyond. Now, we had some states like Massachusetts that went prenatal and really reached beyond grade 12 into sort of post-secondary, but that would define family engagement in a unifying way, and that were co-developed and co-built with the field, with the community. We can go on to the next slide. So one of the, when we think about these frameworks, one of the main purposes really was to start by communicating the importance of family engagement across all levels of education, from state education agencies, which were the primary populations that we were working with, so the SEAs that many of you are partnering with, to school districts, schools, and thinking about broader stakeholders and families. Oftentimes what we found is when people say family and community engagement, it means different things to different people. And the values and priorities might be a little bit different. Different states also have different needs for focus. So while all of these frameworks tended to look very similarly, it was really important to begin by communicating kind of a shared message and be on the same page. So these frameworks gave an opportunity for state education agencies and local stakeholders to really think about that common set of goals in a lot of ways. This was a vision for what family and community engagement could look like in the field if we all work together and galvanize to make that happen. The next slide. And so we really see one of the things that the frameworks can do, one of the values, is to really be the lens that helps to assess and vet new policies, practices, really thinking about this heightened expectation for family and community engagement. And then it became an organizing framework in many states so that they could organize their resources, new trainings that they were developing, new toolkits or parent guides, really thinking about how all of those fit together and help give a lot of the states a more comprehensive approach. We go on to the next slide. Much of the process that states engaged in, and this happened, this wasn't a linear process, but states had to start by assessing themselves and figuring out where some of their areas of growth and opportunity were for engaging in family and community engagement work. Establishing a state coalition, so to make sure that there were stakeholders involved in the process of building and developing this process, working with them to identify what those important values, guiding principles, and tenets were of the framework in order to be able to put something together and put that out. And then we worked with many of these states to then do an external kind of assessment of where the state policies were, thinking about how state systems were addressing family and community engagement, looking at things like the grants that were approved by each state and whether or not family engagement fit into the various grant programs, whether there was guidance to the field that lined up with those frameworks, whether or not there were trainings, whether family and community engagement was addressed at the major conferences the state hosted. So really thinking comprehensively about the different opportunities within states to incorporate family and community engagement. And then the final kind of implementation of that framework, really thinking about making those changes and beginning to put that framework in the hands of the field. We saw that there were a lot of opportunities through this process. If you're in a state that has already gone through the process of developing a framework, there's an opportunity around implementation to really think about the integration of these frameworks, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later. But in states that are still in the process of developing one or that have not yet communicated what family and community engagement means, there's so much opportunity to make sure that that's an inclusive process. Many PTICs already have established relationships with local organizations that are family serving, with many families and parent leaders, and are able to bring sort of that voice and that engagement to the process. I can go on to the next one. So one of the reasons why, you know, that collaborative work was so important is, you know, sometimes it's advocacy. And we know that PTICs, advocacy is such an important part of the work, but really having that unified voice around advocacy, around the role that all families should have, and ensuring that the voices of the specific needs that families of students with special needs might have are included in that conversation, whether it's work that's happening around Title I or 21st century or English language learning, early childhood or special education, really making sure that that diversity of voices and perspectives is presented around advocacy, ensuring that there's good communication and dissemination. If you're in a state that already has a framework, what are ways that the PTIC could be engaged in communicating that framework and those principles and incorporating them into the work? But then also, you know, in those states that don't have them, as these initiatives are happening, what are ways that you could communicate and really connect the constituency that you serve to that process? Next. So there is, you know, in so many ways, those coalitions, we really urge, you know, bring a more grounded voice to the work of state education agencies. And, you know, working in silos is, you know, tends to be the norm. I was at a state education agency for 5 years, and so often that was just sort of, you know, every department is running and doing its work, and there is a lot of isolation, just, you know, sometimes by the sheer volume of the work. But having these external stakeholders, having statewide partners like PTICs, like Statewide Family Engagement Centers, like state PTAs at the table, along with the voices of families, families of students with special needs, families of English language learners, families of foster children, right? Just thinking about that broad engagement could really help to shape how implementation happens and could help shape policy. Developing and maintaining networks. We know networks are so important, and making sure that there are strong connections across these different groups that are working with families across. Oftentimes, you know, our engagement with families tends to be very programmatic within education based on funding, you know, or a particular program. But we really saw these efforts as being able to connect families and connect the dots. And then contributing to implementation and sustainability. You know, frameworks don't do anything on their own until they're used. And so having this common language, this shared language, is such an important way to begin to think about everyone's individual work in working with families, and how, you know, everyone could be a contributor, whether you do training, whether you offer a website with resources, whether you have toolkits, whether you have a call center, right? How could that really help to advance engaging families in, you know, schools across your state? So next, on the next slide, you'll see you know, these are some of the frameworks that were developed under this project, and you should be able to download this presentation from the conference app. and these are all live links, but you can see them there to take a look at. If your state is listed, take a look at your state's framework. If your state is not listed, take a look at a few of these frameworks, toolkit, resource pages to see where there might be some opportunity for your state to go through a process like this that can really bring different stakeholders together to have a conversation about the importance of engaging family and community in your state. And I'll turn it back over.
So the state frameworks are really, really powerful tools, and we are really fortunate to have Cambria here because we wanted to really talk in greater depth about one of the frameworks in particular, and that's the Massachusetts framework. And Cambria, through the Statewide Family Engagement Center there, has been a really, really important partner in rolling out the framework, the development of the framework, and finally, what's coming is the implementation of the framework. So this is a picture of it. It's actually sort of a booklet. It's like over 40 pages with some really, really good content. First of all, the framework has some guiding principles that really outline exactly what they believe in when it comes to family engagement in Massachusetts. And you should also know that in Massachusetts, their framework is not limited to the area of education. It's a cross-sector framework. So it's also relevant for the fields of health and mental health. And so there are a lot of partners and state agencies that were involved in the development and are going to be involved in the implementation. And those guiding principles are relevant to all of them, regardless of the agency that they're in. And the guiding principles overlay the key elements that are a part of the framework that are based on those principles. And those key elements are embedded throughout the document. The document also pays particular attention to family transitions and building capacity. Family transitions are important because that's a really great opportunity. Change is hard. And when families are going through transitions, there are a lot of things that schools and agencies and organizations can do to support those families. And strengthening capacity is critical too, because we have to have the internal capacity to support the work of families. And it's important also to strengthen the capacity of families to work in partnership with us. So I mentioned the elements that are embedded throughout the framework in Massachusetts. These are those elements: building positive relationships, promoting family well-being, promoting pathways for partnerships with families, and supporting child and youth development and learning. And inside their framework, they've actually gone through and embedded examples of high quality practice in all of these areas. It's a really, really powerful tool. The capacity building is another really important part of this. When they talk about capacity building in the Massachusetts framework, we look at 4 key areas. We look at how do we use staffing as a way to build the capacity to provide better support to families. We look at resource development strategies because you have to have resources to get this work done, right? And then there's also training and professional development strategies because you have to be constantly working on sustaining the capacity and then strengthening it of all of your staff. And then finally, evaluation strategies can be used to strengthen the work that you do. So we're going to ask Cambria, I think, to talk about the impact the state can have on family engagement.
So we actually have a few questions that we wanted to ask you all. Could you advance the slides a bit, Sherri? Or Reyna, did you want to say anything about these before we move on? You're muted, Reyna.
Apologies about that. So as you think about the impact that states might have on family engagement, particularly because all of your PTICs are state level entities, but you know as well as we do, family and community engagement happens through relationships, which typically happen at a very local level. and relationship building is something that happens over time. And so, we really wanted to have you all think about ways that the state, whether or not they're the ones that are directly engaging families, and I think there are opportunities for states to directly engage with families, really think about the different ways that that state agency as a partner, and you all are hearing, every day about, family and community engagement happening really well in some places. And there are certain things that need to be in place, certain conditions that just really help to foster that. And those places that are struggling. And, as you're identifying those barriers, things that are making it challenging to engage in those partnerships, we wanted to ask you about thinking, how could the state education agency as a partner support the conditions that foster those partnerships and help to reduce those barriers, whether it's through policy, whether it's through resource development, and so many different opportunities that might be out there.
So with that said, we want to spend a few minutes hearing from all of our participants. So we want to know how you would rate your current collaboration with your state, 1 being poor and 5 being fantastic.
This is anonymous, so feel free to be honest.
You can tell the truth. All right. Oh, it's moving fast up and down. All right, so an overall score, it looks like of 3.2. So a little bit better than the middle, I guess. I'm really interested to hear about experiences from that 6% and the number 5. So maybe you guys will have a chance to share a little bit later. Okay.
Oh, that's down.
Oh, now we have another question. Yeah. So now can you tell us how extensive your relationships with non-special education departments are in your state? How extensive are your relationships with non-special education departments? All right, we have 0% in the 5. Interesting. Okay. Now, we want to go to those questions that Reyna introduced to us. And here you're going to type in ideas, any ideas about how states can support the conditions that foster partnerships between families, schools, and communities. And as those ideas pop up, then you can give a thumbs up to the ones that you like the best. So let's take a couple of minutes to think about that. Sorry about my dog barking. So once you've typed something in, look through everyone else's answers and give thumbs up to the ones that really kind of ring true for you. See one that you like, Sherri? Was that you laughing?
Yeah. The financial seems to be doing really well.
So of financial support around fostering partnerships. Okay, so let's just look at the top few. The most popular ones were build the capacity of educators so they are more willing and better prepared to support families. Financial is another really popular one. Then we have the example of a town hall and using school staff to distribute information. That's great. So connections between the PTIC and the school, devoting time to collaboration, and creating that environment that stresses the importance of engagement. Those are great. Okay, we have another and final question for you all. The same kind of process. Now let's talk about how states can reduce the barriers to these relationships. So you guys gave us some nice ideas on how they can foster partnerships, and now let's think about reducing the barriers. Okay, now go through and give some thumbs up to the ones that make most sense to you. Okay, it looks like our most popular answer is make sure it's culturally inclusive and available in multiple languages. This is an excellent point and sometimes a difficult one. Focus on collaboration. Educators need time and space to collaborate. Promote the success of collaborations. Be more approachable. Excellent. All right, thank you all for sharing your ideas. We're going to want to hear from you all again a little bit later, but that helps give us some more information and also lets you guys share some inspiration with each other, I hope. All right, I'll turn it back over.
There we go. So, you know, when we talk about the sort of what these frameworks can actually look like in practice, implementation, sort of these state level implementation opportunities, there's, you know, we think there's a lot of opportunity for building a lot of what you all were talking about, really, in terms of reducing barriers, creating conditions, and yes, money's on the table. That's usually the first thing we go to, but it doesn't stop at money. You know, I think there are really a lot of opportunities here. So when we look at the you know, sort of these frameworks and the work that they can do, there is, you know, really an opportunity for making sure that, you know, from this common platform, you know, as we've worked state by state, we've conducted interviews, we've looked at their different documents and things, and what we find is there's a lot of family and community engagement work happening. We have yet to find a state that didn't have family and community engagement work happening. But what happens more often than not is that it's siloed. I used to oversee the divisions of English language learning and early childhood at a state education agency, and remember how hard the work was to connect those departments to the work of all the other departments, because, you know, oftentimes we had different grant priorities and there were different timelines, and, you know, it just, there were all these reasons why things were not coordinated. but there's so much value for transitions to support families to have and really bring all these things together. And so, you know, the framework offers that initial platform for being able to start to do that. And it really becomes meaningful when both the state and its partners are using it together. And that includes entities like PTICs and any other programs that are offering direct training to families, that are building resources, that are trying to connect across departments. Because we know that families touch many different programs, and you could have a family that is touched by the Department of English Language Learners, and touched by the Special Education Department, and touched by the Early Childhood Department. But we really want to make sure that there's a coordination of that experience, and in so many ways, you know, these frameworks can really try to help guide those things by coordinating, by creating shared language, shared buckets, ways that you could build from the work instead of duplicating the work that's happening. So we can go on to the next area. Yeah, so this one, you know, as we think about the approach that we've taken, and we push this through, you know, the work that we've done around those opportunity canvases that I had mentioned, is really thinking about ways that state education agencies in particular, but this is also true, and we've been working in Massachusetts with other state agencies like the Department of Health and Public Health, their early childhood agency, their library system, and others, is really thinking about the work that that state agency does every day, whether it's monitoring, you know, they collect reports, they process grant funds. Oftentimes they're allocating grant dollars. They're deciding what kind of priorities are going to be funded, from their RFPs to their rubrics to, you know, just all these different things that they're doing every day. We talk about how they can apply different levers of change, different tools that they can use to start to move the field and to help create conditions and build field capacity for family and community engagement. Those levers of change are things like money. How can they use their funding differently? Where are there opportunities for, new funding is always welcome, but ensuring that existing funds are used to prioritize family and community engagement, that resources are being developed, like trainings, or making sure that new information for families is done in a family-friendly way, right? There are a lot of different resources that are directed at the state level. We talk about messaging. How can the state communicate the importance of families? How can they communicate with families and really create a message of cohesion instead of what we hear over and over, sort of the message of, you know, that add-on approach, and you also have to work with the families, makes it sound like something that is just one more thing on someone's plate, when in fact what we all know is it really does take the coordination and the collaboration of the school, the family, and the school is, you know, not just the classroom teacher, but, you know, there may be a psychologist, a social worker, the parent liaison, the translator, all these different people working together to advance education. We talk about marveling. So how do you elevate best practices? And how do you make sure that those best practices are front and center and are in front of all school districts? One of the things that I found as we've conducted interviews with PTICs and some of you in the states that we're working with is that in some states there's a really strong connection, but in others, you know, the information that's available through the PTIC isn't always hosted in a more centralized place at a statewide family, at the state education agency. So if you're working in the Title I office, you may have never taken a look at the resources that are available at the PTIC. And so if there are best practices that are being shared, if there are features in a newsletter, if there is a place where that's housed, making those connections and making sure that that's accessible to all principals, to all superintendents, really across the board, to people in other departments, parts of the agency. We talk about monitoring and measuring. One of the things that we found has been very underutilized in a lot of state education agencies are things like the Indicator 8 parent surveys that many of you are probably connected with, but I found that there are some state agencies where there are staff in key departments like Title I that may not even be aware of those surveys, that may not be leveraging that information as they're carrying out their Title I school improvement planning or things like that. And that's a huge piece of information and data from families that should be part of that process. So thinking about how all of those touch points can really be leveraged in the field. And so as we think about the role that PTIC can play in all of that as advocates, as partners, as developers of resources and tools and trainings that may or may not already have connections to all those other departments beyond the exceptional student or special education department, really thinking about how that can connect to their research and evaluation department, their curriculum and instruction department that may be putting out tools or resources for parents around things like the standards, but may or may not have that connection to some of the work that you all are doing and carrying out. And we think ultimately all of that can really lead to having a stronger, really having the conditions for having those strong partnerships at the local level. So that state work can really translate into shifts in practice and local policy. We can go on to the next slide. We have, so here are a couple of examples from Massachusetts again, just thinking about ways that they've begun to shift as they're implementing their framework. One of the first things, and this was a recommendation we had made when we were working with them, was their state website had no centralized place for families to find resources. So if you were a parent, many parents, and we found this through interviews as well, don't see the state as a resource necessarily for families. They sort of focus on their local level, but there's a lot of information that can be provided at the state. And so one of the things that Massachusetts did was create a parent portal that you can get to easily from their main website. And from there, you should be able to access the different types of resources that are available to families from across their departments, kind of thinking about that parent-centered approach, the concerns that families have, and making sure that there are easily accessible ways to get there from here. As I was looking, Sherri and I both did research on state education agency websites from across the country. And one of the things that was missing in some states is even being able to connect to the Parent Training Information Center. In some states, I was looking for that information and had to do 7 clicks, 6 or 7 clicks to get to that information. And that was because I knew what I was looking for. In other states, I couldn't find a link at all. And other places that was easily accessible through a centralized place, designed for families. So it's not enough sometimes just to have the information out there, but making sure that those connections are there and that they're integrated. The next example is, I'll pass over to Sherri to talk about.
So we are working with Massachusetts right now to develop some tools and strategies to implement their framework. And one of the ways that we're doing that is building a series of modules that will bring that framework to life. So the modules are going to be housed at the Federation by the SFEC online, and anybody in the state or anywhere really will be able to log on and go through each of the 4 modules that really illustrate what's in the Massachusetts framework. The first module is sort of an introduction to the framework. The second module is a deeper dive into the framework. The third module is based on having culturally responsive family engagement practices. And then the last module is, we call it, where do we go from here? And it's really a deeper dive into the transition and the capacity building in the framework. So we're working together with the SFEC in Massachusetts and other partners to finish the modules up and get those posted online. In the meantime, we are also going to do a train the trainers. So we're going to train a cadre of people from across the state with different key constituencies to deliver the content of those modules live. They'll be able to do it virtually until this nightmare ends and we're able to meet people in person again, but then they'll be able to go into their own communities or agencies or organizations and deliver this training across the state. So people will really have a better sense of how this framework can strengthen the work that they do and really guide their own practice. We're super excited that Cambria is here today because she's been a key partner in the development of these implementation tools. And it's going really well. We're excited to see where we go from here. The other thing you should know about is other work that the statewide family engagement centers are doing. So there are 12 states with statewide family engagement centers, and their purpose is to provide technical assistance and training to state agencies and local agencies to develop and enhance the systemic and effective family engagement policies, programs, and practices. That looks very different in each of the SFECs that are out there. In a perfect world, we would have an SFEC in every state. We don't yet, but I think it's really important for everybody to know about the work that the SFECs are doing, because if you're in a state that has one, you can partner with them. You can provide some support to the work that they're doing and maybe take advantage of some of the opportunities that they offer. And if you're in a state that doesn't have an SFEC, it's a really good opportunity for you to learn about what's happening in those other states. So you might be able to replicate some of those practices on your own, or to advocate for increased funding so we can get more SFECs in every state. The other thing that SFECs are charged with doing is carrying out parent education and family engagement in education programs and training and TA to schools and school districts and other organizations. So just like the PTIs work with families and schools school districts to support families, PTIs do, or I'm sorry, SFECs do very similar work. Their focus is often different because it doesn't have that special education focus. But that's another reason why it's really important to work together if you're in a state with an SFEC, or to maybe replicate some of the work that SFECs are doing in your own state if you don't have one. Here's a list of the states that do have SFECs right now. So you can look and see if your state is on the list. One thing you'll notice is Maryland and Pennsylvania are grouped together. That is one center for two states. It's the only center that serves more than one state. That is the Mid-Atlantic Equity Consortium. They do a lot of work around equity in addition to their SFEC work. But all of these centers are required to work with PTIs. So if you don't know who the people are in your state that are doing this work and you see your state on this list, you should reach out to them. It is a responsibility for them to work with you. So you can drop them a line and say, hey, let's connect. I really want to know what you're doing and how we can work together. I think they'd be happy to hear from you.
All right, Sherri set me up there just right. So I just want to talk a little bit about how PTICs and SFECs can fit together, first at a high level and then more practically how the Massachusetts PTIC and SFEC work together. So to begin with, there's this basic shared philosophy between the two programs and grants. Both of them are really rooted in promoting family engagement and strengthening capacity of families and their professional partners. This connects to what Sherri was just saying. There's also some alignment across grant activities and the requirement that the SFECs collaborate with the PTICs. In Massachusetts, we're really lucky to have both the PTIC and the SFEC housed within the Federation, so that makes collaboration much more straightforward. It's probably why we're doing a good bit of it. We have frequent meetings across projects. I'm working with Ruth Diaz, the director of the PTIC. Frequently, we share our plans for what we're doing, our data and reports, to determine how we can support each other's work. So an example would be, at a recent presentation given by our Family Engagement Center, we referred a participant to the Information Center that's run by the PTIC. And at the same time, we will be using the data from the Information Center to help determine the needs of the families in Massachusetts as we plan our activities as an SFEC. So we have this kind of back and forth going on all the time. And it's important that we understand the work of each other's projects so that collaboration can continue to happen and ultimately greater impact. So we are able to provide technical assistance to one another. We promote events together. For example, we had the PTIC provide the content for a session with families that we were working with at the SFEC. We just try to build off of each other's outreach. Across the Federation, we use a cultural broker model to build parents' knowledge and ability to access services. And the PTIC and the SFEC work with our Federation outreach staff to connect with communities in culturally and linguistically competent ways. And we share information about cultural brokers in our communities across projects so that we can broaden outreach for both programs. So we work together a lot, and at the same time, both of the projects are continuously working with the state. Sherri was letting you know about the support work that we're doing in rolling out the family engagement framework. Some of our staff were involved in the development of those frameworks. Right now, the work on these modules, we have people coming in and looking at them and giving feedback from the Massachusetts Department of Education, from other state agencies. We've had someone from Family Voices, from our center. So lots of people coming together to work on this from the state, from other agencies. And we all work together to kind of give voice for families to the state agencies. And we're lucky in Massachusetts that they are open to collaborating with us on that. So I could go on forever because I have experienced a lot of learning and growth across our programs from the process of collaborating, but I actually would love to hear from everyone here in attendance. I know that we have a particular set of circumstances in Massachusetts that lend themselves to cross-project collaboration, but I'm wondering if you can think of ways that in your current situation, you can connect with and support your state's family engagement work, whether that be through a statewide family engagement center or through collaboration with the state. So I just want to give everybody a second to think about that. If you have thoughts on what you might do after this presentation, I'd love you to drop them in the chat so I can see what people are planning and see if I can steal some of your ideas. And as you're thinking about how you might want to move forward with collaborating with the state or with your SFEC, we are open to questions and answers.
Yes. And we wanted to leave plenty of time for questions, answers, sharing. And so feel free to use the chat. Or, if you can raise your, I think they have the hand raise feature, but we'd love to definitely hear some of that thinking and some of those ideas, because we know every single state has its own priorities, its own work that's happening right now. Obviously, with the COVID-19 pandemic, there's been a huge shift in where the priorities are. And we understand that now, from our perspective, now more than ever, it is critical for states to really build up those connections and to be able to think holistically about the experiences of families across a range of different circumstances, because equity can't just be a value that we hold, it really needs to be a practice. And that requires thinking about the situation that different families are facing and being able to offer, some of those differentiated solutions. But that requires dialogue, that requires building capacity, and we see such a huge role for that partnership in kind of this quick mobilization that's been taking place over the last, 6 to 8 months.
So I know that there's some participants here who are partners in their state's SFECs, and I'm wondering if any of them are willing to share some of the work that you're doing.
Cheryl Thompson just wrote in the chat that in Missouri, they do a conference call once a week with their state special ed compliance director to collaborate with all of the changes. That is a great connection and really a great way to have a seat at that table. Good for you, Missouri.
One thing I didn't mention earlier, we're seeing this more and more. This was part of the process with the development of the frameworks, but we've encouraged states to keep these. Some states have established a family and community engagement team within their state, that meets cross-team. They might have a representative from special education, one from early childhood, one from 21st century or Title I. And many states have maintained them. Some states have an office for family and community engagement. And in some states, it's the person from that office that coordinates that team. Massachusetts has that approach. They also have a cross-agency team that has representatives from multiple agencies at the table. And one of the things that we encourage is for those teams to have a way of engaging with those external partners and stakeholders, so that whether you're an organization focused on bilingual parent advisory councils or the PTIC, or in some places that maybe there's a health and wellness organization, right, that partners with the state. But to really bring that into a cross-sector space, because in some states, they sort of have their individual, each department has its stakeholders, its external stakeholders. Even when they're doing external stakeholder engagement well, there isn't always a connection across departments. And so as they were building these systems, what many states found was, each department has its go-to stakeholders, but they didn't know those organizations in other departments. They didn't connect with them on a regular basis. And it was by bringing everyone together that they were really able to begin to inform kind of that bigger picture. To the comment that I think Jim Wright had made a little bit earlier around where kind of priorities lie sometimes within state agencies.
Here's a question from Charles. He said, any idea what states require districts to have a parent special education advisory committee? Texas dropped that requirement years ago. Now there's just a state level committee, but it's not super helpful. I feel committees that can improve communication and process is much better than state committees and even the state education agency. Reyna, do you know of any?
Absolutely. And when put on the spot, I always think, oh my goodness, the states sometimes blend together in my mind. I want to say that Michigan is one of the states that requires local special education advisories, but I'm not entirely sure. I think that we have a feature within the conference. This is correct for Michigan, is what Emily is saying.
Oh,
I know that there are several states. Thank you, participants, for jumping in. You know, one of the things that I thought was great in Michigan as we were looking at some of their different groups, there are a number of local advisory committees and councils that they require. I believe they require one for school improvement, at least for districts that are in a particular category. And they have Great Start local councils for early childhood. They have the ones for special education, and they have some trainings. There was one training that really called my attention in Michigan that was particularly for parent leaders who are serving on any one of these leadership groups. It was called something like the Parents in Government Training, or Parent Leaders in State Government, something like that. But building capacity across these different committees and coalitions, recognizing in some communities, I know that when I used to work at a local parent information center that primarily serviced the special education parent advisories and the bilingual parent advisories, that was in Illinois. I believe Illinois has that requirement as well. They didn't coordinate. And so we started to create structures and systems for coordinating and building parent leadership across those different advisory councils. But we'll go ahead and drop some information in the follow-up, I think, for the app, if anything more specific comes up.
Oh, Deborah Jennings has beaten you to it, Reyna. She just put in the chat box the states that require, some of the states that require local special education advisory committees. And then she said where they can find a guide for starting and sustaining their own, which is awesome. Everyone should do it. Does anyone else have other questions?
Yeah. Hi. Hi. I'm from New York. My name is Helene Fallon. And I wanted to say a couple of things. One is we've frantically been working on this for a very long time. And I work with the New York State Regional Collaborative PTIC and also with the state funded center. And so one of the things that's really interesting as I listen to your presentation is the importance of the communication across all the different initiatives. And you mentioned that Century 21 and looking at special ed and general ed. And that's where I've been on committees with Dr. Alston. You sent the contact information. When I clicked on it, what was really interesting to me, and I think is a real success for NAFSCE, is they have moved teacher development or a portion of teacher development into that FACE office. And I think that's fantastic. They may only be looking at, again, family engagement in teacher preparation, but I know that's something you guys had worked on. We've been working in New York on that. So I just wanted to mention that I think we're definitely out of the door and we're running with it, but across the state. But I think that it's the lack of coordination amongst all the different initiatives sometimes that kind of holds things back from really being, getting implemented on a very local level.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. And you mentioned educator preparation. We've done a lot of work on that, and I'll go ahead and include a link to some of that work in the chat. But one of the things that we found, which is both great and also, kind of tragic in some ways, is, when you look at educator preparation across the board, we just put out a report on the standards required of all teachers for educator preparation around family and community engagement, and states are all over the place. But oftentimes we see much more robust standards for family and community engagement for special educators, for early childhood, but not for all teachers, or not for secondary teachers, or, and when you start looking at other areas, right? Like, that's a huge missed opportunity, but it's also a huge opportunity and a resource moving forward. So as we're pushing states as a national association to do more work in this area, and we have a pre-service consortium focused on thinking about educator and administrator preparation across the board, many states already have some standards or some expectations to look to turn to within kind of their special educator standards, if they have a separate set of, an endorsement or something like that. But oftentimes what you find in there really isn't specific. It's something that across the board would be great for all educators. You talk about supporting families around learning. You talk about advocacy and all these different pieces of skills, knowledge, dispositions that could be helpful. And really, we should be preparing all of our teachers to be able to do that. So I'll go ahead and include the link to that information in the chat.
Mm-hmm. Are there other questions that we could answer for you while we have this time together?
Or possibly examples of how you think that you might move forward with trying to collaborate more closely or more often.
Yeah, we would love to hear from you about things you're doing that are working really well, so we could probably spread that word and others could do those things as well.
Yeah, and I would encourage just you all to think about both drop in the chat, if you want to raise your hand or unmute yourself to share, but thinking about kind of the two approaches at least. One, how can your centers add value to the work that's already happening? Like, how can you support, integrate, align, enhance the work that's happening at the state level? But then also thinking about how those other resources, if you have a framework in your state, if there's a family engagement team, if there's a statewide family engagement center, what are ways that they could support your work? And that they could enhance your work, whether it's by getting your message out or by co-developing training, or just where do you see those opportunities?
Anne dropped a comment in the chat about entering into an MOU with a major district to collaborate with their community and family engagement department. And she also commented that during this time of COVID-19, we've observed greater recognition of the importance of parents and family as partners. I would agree. We have had that same experience, a bit of an awakening for family engagement, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also a reminder about your session evaluation in the chat box. So definitely please make sure you provide the conference with feedback about that. Any other opportunities that you all identify or see, especially right now as so many states are trying to figure out how to meet the individual needs of children and families and partner with families to make sure that all children are served, whether they're at home, remote, hybrid. So essential. Okay.
Well, feel free to email us your success stories too. I'm always looking for a good success story. So reach out if you would like to share some collaboration that has gone well. And I'll drop my email in the chat.
Yeah, and so you can all definitely reach out to us, through the app as well. We have and wanted to make sure that you're all aware. If if you're not already, NAFSKY has a range of resources. We're doing new research, and there is an online member community that's really been trying to connect practitioners and folks from across states so that there could be some cross-state learning. We have a community for statewide family engagement centers there. We have a community for state education agencies there, and would love to, continue to make connections, which we think is just super essential in this field.
Thank you guys so much for joining us today. It has been our honor really to share with you the little we know. I especially want to thank Cambria, who is a rock star and doing tremendous work in Massachusetts. And I'm so happy that she was able to join us today so we could share some of that with you as well.
Well, thank you both for inviting me to to share in this. Thanks.